QSO Today, episode 431, Walt Stinson W0CP. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts Magazine. Save the date for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, March 25th and 26th, 2023. Follow the link to the Expo website for more information. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is up on YouTube once again. I'm posting presentations from the last expo in September until they run out for everyone to watch. I have over 370 total presentations from 5 expos and posting a few every day if possible. Please help me out by subscribing to the channel. It is very important as a way to get the word out about the expo and the whole QSO Today project. Walt Stinson W0CP, love of shortwave listening, amateur radio, and electronics led him to a career as an entrepreneur and founder of ListenUp in Denver, Colorado. Walt remained on the cutting edge of the consumer electronics industry, leading to his induction into the Consumer Electronics Association Hall of Fame. W0CP enjoys working DX, contesting, and now summits on the air from the Colorado Rocky Mountains. And he is my QSO Today. W0CP, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Walt?
4Z1UG, W0 Charlie Papa.
Thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, Walt. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
It started for me, Eric, in 1958. I was 10 years old, and after school, I was invited to go over to a friend's house, and he had a shortwave radio there, and we played with it.
Do you remember what kind of radio it was?
I don't remember what kind of radio it was. I don't. I think it might have been a Hallicrafters because that's what I ended up getting later. I got so enthralled with what I heard that day over at his house that I immediately went home, told my parents that I had to have a shortwave radio, and 3 or 4 months later, Christmas came around, and that's what was under the tree for me.
What do you think that experience was that excited you so much about listening to that shortwave radio the first time?
The world. The experience was of the world. I was living in Little Rock, Arkansas at the time, and I had no concept of the world. And I went over to his house, and there were, we tuned around, and I heard the world.
The world was alive.
It captured my imagination in a major way, in a big way.
What kind of a receiver did you get for Christmas?
I got a Hallicrafters S38E, which was a pretty popular entry-level general coverage shortwave receiver. I think it probably cost around $50 in 1958, which actually was a lot of money for my parents to spend on me.
My father says in those years that $90 was a month's salary, maybe. Is that possible? He was a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, you can go online and look up how much $50 was, and it was a lot of money. It indicated, I think, that my parents thought that this was a worthwhile activity for me to be engaged in. And, of course, my parents would have known about Marconi, and Marconi got started when he was a teenager, so I think that influenced a lot of parents' attitudes about their kids getting involved in shortwave radio when they were young in that era, right after World War II.
About the same time, I think we had Sputnik, I think that same year, right?
Sputnik went up. Yeah, I remember trying to tune in Sputnik. I don't remember ever hearing it, but I certainly tried to hear it.
So you became a serious shortwave listener? Did you right away for QSL cards and things like that?
I did. I was a shortwave listener. I never had an Elmer. So I didn't know anything about ham radio at that point in time. I just listened, and eventually I heard about ham radio and started hearing hams, and I wanted to get their QSL cards. So I got a QSL card that said SWL-W0. I was in St. Louis, the suburb of St. Louis at the time, when I got those cards from Walter Ash Radio Company in St. Louis, Missouri. I had moved from Little Rock to St. Louis at that point.
And Walter Ash made what kind of radios?
They were a dealer in a very large ham radio dealer in St. Louis, Missouri, and they sold everything and anything that a ham could want. But when I started out as an SWL, I didn't know anything. I remember hearing about the call book, and my mom bought me a call book, and I tuned in the ham bands, and one day I heard K5 Alpha Juliet Yankee, a man named Pappy on 80 meters, and he was booming in, and so I looked him up in my call book, and he was maybe 6 or 7 miles away. I looked him up in the phone book. I called him on the phone, asked him if I could come over to his house and see his ham station. And my mom took me over there. I was 11 years old when I saw my first ham station.
And how did Pappy react to you when you came in?
Oh, he was fantastic. He took me into his ham shack, which was very impressive, and told me all about ham radio. And I think I spent about an hour at his house. But unfortunately, we moved away shortly after that. I never had an Elmer, so I had to figure out how to navigate into ham radio more or less on my own.
And what was your next step after that? Once you moved again, you set up the shortwave station.
Yeah, I set up my SWL station in St. Louis, and then I got into junior high school, and I heard about some teenage hams in St. Louis that were on the air. I never met any of them, but I met a friend who knew somebody who was a ham, and we both made a pact that we would get our novice license. I got a license manual, started studying it, and off I went.
And you got your first license when?
1963, 5 years after so I was an SWL for 5 years, and it was a good education. I certainly learned a lot about propagation, and I could tune the entire spectrum from AM all the way up to the top of 10 meters, and I was always listening and exploring and seeing what I could hear. I loved to listen to Radio Moscow, by the way. I thought that was very exotic.
What was your first call sign?
My first call sign was Whiskey November 0 Germany Juliet Zulu.
And did you like CW at the time?
I did. I loved CW. I mean, that's really all I had. It's funny when all you have is CW, you just kind of accept it. So, I just accepted. I learned CW by having a friend send CW to me until I could pass the 5-word a minute test, and then as soon as I got my license, I was on the air as a novice. Eric, I think about that today. We had watering holes back then, and you could get on the air as a brand new ham, and you could have QSOs at 5 words a minute. I don't hear that happening today. A lot of the hams that I Elmer don't think that they can really have a QSO until they can master 20 words a minute.
I mean, I feel the same way, frankly, that we go to CW Academy and we do a lot of practice in order to make, our Broadway debut.
Right, exactly.
We don't want to play a smaller stage. I get that, and I get the impression perhaps that a lot of new hams go straight to, say, if on HF, they go to FT8 or one of the digital modes.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
There's less risk of, screwing it up.
Yes, that's right. And the hijinks that we engaged in the novice bands back in that day when we got on the air at 5 words a minute. I mean, I remember my first QSO with a DX station. The guy was in Canada, and I had him repeat his call sign 10 times to me because I couldn't imagine that I was possibly talking to somebody outside the United States. I mean, it didn't even cross my mind that was even possible to do that. Eventually he went away, and I had a whole piece of paper where I'd written down everything 50 times, and eventually I put it together that what his call sign actually was, And wow, I can talk to somebody outside the United States. But, as a kid, it didn't even cross my mind that was even possible.
What was the first rig?
My first rig was a DX40. I built a lot of Heathkits, and so I had a DX40 and my S38E general coverage receiver, which left a lot to be desired as a receiver, but I made do with it.
And I'm assuming that you operated a lot. I remember operating as a novice. It was grueling and terrifying. And no one had ever taught me how to actually adjust my straight keys so that it didn't feel like I had a glass arm by the time I was done with my QSO.
Yeah. Well, we had a good ham club in my high school, later as I got older, and we must have had 100 hams in my ham club in high school, if you can imagine that.
No, I can't imagine.
Yeah, it was amazing. The learning went quickly later. Just a few years after. Once I got into high school, the learning curve was pretty dramatic. So, yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your career in education after high school?
Well, I went to an interesting high school. It was Webster Groves High School in a suburb of St. Louis, and they happened to have an industrial arts program, and in that program they had an electronics, 2-year electronics diploma that you could get, and it was pretty serious education. It was 2 hours a day for 2 years. So that would be the equivalent in hours of an associate's degree, maybe even a bachelor's degree in some curriculum. So I enrolled in that, much to the chagrin of my parents and my guidance counselor, who told me that if I wanted to go to college, I needed to be taking advanced placement, math and science courses and language and so forth. And I just said, well, I want to take electronics. So I talked a few of my buddies into joining me, and we all ended up doing extremely well academically later in our lives. But we graduated from high school with a 2-year training in electronics, and that ended up being a very significant influencer in my life. I went on to a liberal arts college in Illinois called Knox in Galesburg, Illinois. I was in a 3-2 program, which meant that 3 years to give you liberal arts so that you weren't a geek when you went to engineering school and graduated from engineering school. So I was going to go to engineering school, 3 years first at liberal arts, so I was going to end up with 2 degrees. I thought that was a wonderful educational path for me. And so I went to Knox, and I ended up getting married as a sophomore and staying at Knox and with my wife. And my 2 years of electronics ended up landing me a job with an electronics distributor and parts house in Galesburg by the name of LaSalle Electronics. And they gave me a job because I could sell parts to TV repairmen. I knew how to read color codes, and I knew what a capacitor was and things like that, which they thought was great. So they gave me a job, and they then branched out into consumer electronics, which was just happening. We've jumped to 1970 into the early 1970s now, or late 60s, and people were just coming back from Vietnam with stereo equipment and so forth, and so they started a consumer electronics department, a small one there, and that was my first exposure to consumer electronics that ended up being my career path.
And now this message from ICOM America. Happy holidays from ICOM. Spice up your ham shack this season with one of ICOM's popular handhelds, mobiles, or base stations. These radios are perfect for working your favorite bands while staying inside or venturing out this winter. It's the most wonderful time of the year to give a gift of ICOM. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. It has become the go-to baseband rig for microwave operators. Its features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen display with a live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8 DC power supply. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot. The HM243 microphone speaker is included, and it supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the ICOM 705 is the optional LC192 backpack. The LC192 includes a special compartment for your IC705 and additional room for accessories. The ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band handheld portable transceiver with D-Star and FM dual-mode functions and is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display. This portable supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. You can even send photos over D-Star using your connected Android device. Other ID52 features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz, VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and of course, it is in an IPX7 waterproof case. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705 as both use batteries, headsets, and the same Android app for D-Star operation. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world and is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy, including faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. More features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD with real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed everyone's expectations. This transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. This radio by far is the best HF rig that I have ever owned. I love it for its features and value. Now I realize that this is a big list to give to Santa. You can easily argue that all of these fine ICOM rigs complement each other, and that you can't just have one without the others. Maybe Santa can even spread out the delivery of these great ICOM rigs before the next holiday season. In any case, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about these amazing ICOM radios on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our guest. When we first started seeing big systems in America, returning servicemen who stopped over in Japan?
That's right, yes. Bringing back Sansui and Kenwood and Marantz and various pieces of equipment from Japan. Yeah, Sansui was the big one, Pioneer.
They were just like on the leading edge of that equipment just starting to wave into America, into American markets, right?
That's right. They weren't really very well established in American markets yet. We had Sherwood and Fisher receivers in the United States. We had Heathkit equipment, and the Japanese had those were all point-to-point wiring products. The Sherwood and Fisher things were point-to-point wiring manufacturing techniques, and the Japanese had moved into circuit board technology, and they had a manufacturing advantage with the Sherwood and the Sansui and Pioneers. So when they hit the U.S., they had much better value for the dollar, much less labor costs.
I remember that period of time that we had 8-track tapes.
We did, yeah.
That was a big deal. Now, there's a story that I understand that you were involved in, at least on the bleeding edge or the leading edge of the compact disc. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, we're jumping ahead to 1982, a bit early 80s. So, I mean, before that, after my stint at LaSalle, I decided to make a career in the consumer electronics industry and shopped around for a city and ended up choosing Denver as the city and moved here with my wife and partner in 1972. I was 23 years old, started the business in Denver, and I started as a broadcast engineer and sound engineer.
For one of the local stations?
No, I was an independent. I was a contractor, and my specialty was live remote broadcast.
Now, can I ask a personal question, if you don't mind? It's just between us. The only reason I moved to Denver, Colorado was because I married a Denver girl. But when I think about Denver at the time, there was nothing there in Denver. There was oil exploration. There was maybe some mining. It didn't seem to me that Denver had a lot of attraction. What was the attraction for you to take your consumer electronics business to Denver?
Well, by this time I had graduated with a degree in economics, and I had been a research assistant for a transportation economist, and I worked summers for him doing statistical analysis on cities to determine what their future transportation needs were going to be. So I did two things when I was shopping for a city. I did a projection on what their future growth prospects were. I did a demographic projection. What's the age demographic and the educational demographic, and then I looked at the potential competition. So the thing that you just mentioned was actually an advantage for me because I didn't have very much money, hardly any money. So I didn't want really strong competition to exist. And because Denver was kind of a cow town in 1972 when I moved there, it didn't have the kind of sophisticated consumer electronics retail ecosystem that Chicago had, places, major metropolitan areas. It certainly wasn't a major metropolitan area at that time. And I think Denver only had about 600,000 residents. So it was perfect. It had the right demographics, it had the right projections, and it had very little in the way of companies that were trying to do what we thought we wanted to do.
And this was before the rise of, say, UPS and FedEx. So you were on major rail lines, major trafficking, if we're talking truck hubs.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So it probably at the time was...
Distribution center,
yeah.
So I had a lot of fun doing the broadcasting. We basically built recording studios. We did remote broadcasting, and then we had a shop that sold commercial sound equipment and home stereo equipment. The broadcast side turned out to be a heck of a lot of fun because we got hired by the regional rock promoter, and we ended up doing 300 or so live recordings and broadcasts of anybody who was anybody in jazz and rock and roll in the 70s through the mid 80s.
So that was Barry
Fay, yeah. I was the contract sound engineer for Barry Fay, Fayline Concerts, one of the major concert promoters in the world. And so we ended up working with the likes of Bob Dylan and U2 and Journey and Santana, and it was an amazing experience for about 10 years. And Barry, the radio stations that we did broadcasting for, they loved it because I told them, because I had the shop and because nobody knew about the shop, I said, well, why don't you just promote me instead of paying me? And so they would give me about $1,000 of radio advertising every time I did a remote broadcast for them, and I was doing 3 or 4 of those a week. So lo and behold, after about 10 years of that, Sound by ListenUp was a catchphrase in the Denver market, and our company started taking off. Eventually, we had to focus on on that business on the consumer electronics side and let go of the broadcasting and that portion of it. We just backed away from it. And Barry went on to big things, but we did 2 concert venues with him, Ebbets Field and the Rainbow Music Hall, and both of those were stopping off points for major artists from around the world, and it was an exciting time.
Was Barry involved in developing Red Rocks too, or did that come after him?
No, Barry had the concession from the city and county of Denver for concerts at Red Rocks. So Red Rocks is a park, a property of the city and county of Denver, and he saw the potential to develop Red Rocks.
Of turning that into a concert venue.
Yeah, to turn it into a concert venue, and now it's one of the premier concert venues in the world. Anybody, when they reach a certain stature, they want to play Red Rocks. It's an amazing experience, both for the artist and for the audience.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, I liked it. It's a beautiful place as well.
Amazing place.
Okay, so what happened after that? So did Denver meet your expectations in terms of your original projections, what you thought it would be and what it has become?
Absolutely. Denver was an amazing market. It was a market in which I was able to get started with very little initial capital and build the business. So by the time the CD came out, we're jumping forward now to 1982, 10 years after the business started, the CD came out, and at that time I had, in 1979, I had started a trade association called the Professional Audio Video Retailers Association, and it grew into about 300 companies. And I was the president of it for a number of years, and then I became the general advisor. And in 1982, they asked me to be the representative of Para to the Compact Disc Group. And the Compact Disc Group was a group of companies that had gotten together to launch digital audio in North America. And it consisted of Sony and Philips. Those were the 2 primary partners on the compact disc. And Polygram was Philips. Sony had their own label, and Polygram was the label of Philips. And they were going to leverage these labels to project compact disc into the North American market. So I was invited to become a member of the Compact Disc Group. I met all the representatives from the consumer electronics industry that were going to be manufacturing these players and the companies that were going to be making the CDs. And they gave me the white papers to study. I studied these white papers and convinced myself that this was definitely going to work. And then I was invited to go to Japan. My partner and I went to Japan, and in Japan we saw players and we saw working players. We saw stores in Tokyo that were already selling compact discs, and so we took the opportunity to buy suitcases and fill them up with compact discs and bring them back to the United States. This was before the CD had even been launched in the U.S., but I had already reached deals with Polygram and Sony that ListenUp would be the first dealer of compact discs in the United States. Turned out that Sony would ultimately pick about 15 companies in North America to launch the compact disc. So I put my marketing hat on and went to town and became an evangelist for the CD, and it was an amazing time to be able to wave this magic disc in front of people. I had a number of public events that attracted over 1,000 people. There were probably 5 events that attracted over 1,000 people. There was a lot of press coverage, TV coverage. It was amazing. I told everybody in the company, you only get one opportunity in life if you're lucky to usher in a totally new revolutionary technology. And that's what the transition from analog to digital was. It was a moment to usher in a brand new technology. And I remember one of my problems, Eric, was I spent these 2 years in studying electronics technology. They didn't teach me digital technology. It was all tubes and analog. And so I had to go to school to study digital and learn about it. And I became quite proficient at explaining digital technology to people, especially in layman's terms. I loved getting in front of the press and talking about it.
I kind of felt with the compact disc that for those of us that loved music in the car, who were tired of trying to pick the cassette tape out of the machine because it got wound up on the capstan inside and you essentially lost all the music, that the compact disc was a game changer in terms of user experience, of good sound. It didn't get noisy like a cassette tape would at a certain point because it got worn out. I thought it was like one of those revolutions in music that seemed to change everything.
Oh, it was, and I was a showman. You would have been one of my press conferences that I held was I took a CD, smeared it with peanut butter, and then dunked it in water, wiped the peanut butter off, took an X-Acto knife and cut a scribe. Let one of the press guys cut a scribe right across the CD with the X-Acto knife. Then I popped it in the player and it played perfect.
Right, nobody could hear the popping.
There was no popping. It played perfectly. So here we are today. We're streaming. Digital audio is what it's all about. And it was fun being a pioneer in that technology. I really enjoyed it.
And, of course, CDs went on to also capture video.
That's right.
I remember when that came out.
DVDs, Blu-rays. Yeah, so that prompted ListenUp to expand into video. The company now spans virtually all consumer electronics categories.
Are you still involved in the company?
I am. I have stepped back. I have ListenUp has a president and an outside board of directors now, and I'm the chair, and I'm very involved in the company.
It's hard to take the company out of the guy, right? If you've been doing it since you were 23 years old.
Oh, I love the company. It's a wonderful company, but I'm not running it. But I'm still very involved in it.
It's my understanding that you were inducted into the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame in 2009. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and what milestone that is?
Well, I was blindsided by it. First of all, I didn't expect it at all. The other people that were inducted into it, Irwin Jacobs, the founder of Qualcomm, and Steve Jobs, that's company that I didn't expect to be associated with, and it also has a number of people in it that kind of relate to my ham radio life. The people who founded Zenith were both hams. Edwin Armstrong is a hero of mine. He invented frequency modulation, and I credit him with popularizing the concept of high fidelity. One of the people who supported me when I was starting the company, Paul Klipsch, who's a pretty well-known engineer, sound engineer. He's in it. So a lot of my heroes were in the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame, and so it was I had a big smile on my face that night. I really was very happy.
So you get this award. Does this award give you the key to CES in Vegas every year? I mean, is there a long-term benefit that, other than that experience, that came from this award?
No, I think that I think it's the latter. I think it's the experience. I mean, I am very involved in CES, especially this year, which maybe we might have time to talk about. No, I think it's a prestigious event in the industry, and whenever you get recognized by your industry peers, there's a warm feeling that goes along with that, because you know that they're your greatest critics. They're the ones who know the things you've done right, but they also know the things you've done, the mistakes that you've made. So when they decide that in total that maybe you're okay, it's a good feeling.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and Company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. We have to get to ham radio, and I'm sure everyone's saying, "Oh, Eric, when are we getting to ham radio?" I'm sure they're not saying that, but let's finish off on the professional stuff, and then we'll move into ham radio. Before we started, you said that you're involved in the HS4A initiative. That's what it sounds like to me. Can you explain a little bit about what HS4A is and what your involvement is in it?
Yes, HS4A stands for Human Security for All. HS4A is a concept that was developed by the United Nations and a decade or more ago. And it is a way of thinking about security that is a non-military way, a non-nation state way. It's a way of thinking about security from the perspective of individuals and how they actually live. And it has 7 pillars, things like economic security, food security, health security, environmental security. But it also includes things like political security, personal security, and community security. And the United Nations decided a year or two ago that they needed a security paradigm that related better to individuals. You know, they have these sustainable development goals that are very popular with nation states and NGOs and so forth. The sustainable development goals were talked about a lot at COP27 over in Egypt just recently. And Biden was over there, and there was a lot of talk about the sustainable development goals. But there's 17 of those. They're technical, and they don't really relate to the individual very well. So the UN decided that they wanted to popularize and publicize human security, the concept of human security, and they invited the World Academy of Art and Science, which is a global academy that was founded by Einstein, Oppenheimer, Bertrand Russell in the wake of World War II to talk about and think about applied technology and how it affects people in both positive and negative ways. And so the World Academy was an ideal partner for the UN to reach out to take this concept and partner with the UN and actually implement it the way the UN wants it implemented, that is publicized. And so I got involved in this about a year ago, and I've been working on it. The first event happens to be CES, coming up in January of 2023. And the CES show this year will be themed Human Security for All. So if you Google CES 2023 Human Security, there'll be tons of material that pops up about it. CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, is interested in this because they understand that innovation, technological innovation, can be a tremendous force for addressing some of the world's most pressing problems. So that's what I'm working on. I am a member of the World Academy of Art and Science, and I got involved when we were putting the proposal together for the UN. The UN approved the proposal in October, just a few months ago, and they are a formal partner with the World Academy in this campaign. They call it a campaign, and the campaign will launch in January and will involve many, many large, prestigious NGO organizations and nonprofits around the world over a period of years. So there is a ham radio connection here. The IARU is a partner of Human Security for All campaign. The IARU is a perfect fit because the IARU is very interested in ham radio for emergency communications purposes, and that fits into the UN's concept of community security. The UN is also very interested in preventative concepts. They want it to be context specific. They want it to be integrated with other organizations, and they want it to be prevention oriented. And it turns out that ham radio is a good fit for all of that. So I'm very excited about the opportunity to reacquaint hams with the important role that they can play in creating community security.
And what is the consumer electronics angle on HS4A?
Well, CTA is, as I said, all about innovation, technological innovation, and they feel that their member companies are becoming more and more aware of issues that can be addressed effectively by technology, and particularly technological innovation. So these would be things like food security. John Deere is interested in how to make equipment that can be utilized in developing countries to help increase crop yields. Water purification systems are important. Health security is a big one because in many underdeveloped countries especially, they only have an annual budget per capita of a couple of $100 for health care. So these gaps in providing basic human security for people really need to be and can be filled by technological innovation. CTA is very aware of that. That's why they signed on to be a partner.
Let's kick over to ham radio now. During this whole time, once you moved to Denver, Colorado, were you involved in the amateur radio community at the same time that you were building your new business?
I've never stopped being involved in ham radio. I have a deep passion and profound passion for ham radio. I love ham radio and have tried to acquaint myself and, get into lots of different aspects of it. I have a bias for CW. I have a bias for HF. But beyond that, if it has to do with HF, I've probably been involved in it on some level or another. So throughout all this period that we've been talking about, I've never stopped being involved in ham radio. And when I moved to Denver, the first thing I did was seek out the contest guys and the DX guys and get acquainted with them and join the clubs and immerse myself in the wonderful ham radio community that exists here in Colorado.
So it seems to me that you've done actually more than that, right? You were once the ARRL director in Colorado. Is there two directors in every state, or like senators, or one director? And
the director is for the Rocky Mountain region. So I was responsible for Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. And there's one director, and we had about 15,000 hams in those four states.
So if you were going to make a case for someone, maybe a newer ham or someone who's been involved in ham radio for a while but is thinking of taking up some kind of leadership position in amateur radio, would you recommend becoming an ARRL director? And if you do, actually having been one, and you've also gone on to the ARRL Foundation board, so you're obviously a supporter of the ARRL, what case would you make for a person to become an ARRL director?
Well, I'm going to turn that question around a little bit. And first, I'm going to make the case for being an ARRL supporter because I run into a lot of people who don't really understand the ARRL. They seem to think that it's some sort of business enterprise in which people have the same motivations that a commercial enterprise owned by shareholders might have. But that's certainly not true. ARRL is run by and for ham radio operators. It's governed by members who have no pecuniary interest whatsoever in their volunteer work that they do. And so there are lots of different ways to volunteer with the ARRL. There are many, many, many positions that the ARRL makes available to hams that want to get involved. There's section manager roles. The director role happens to be the one that carries the most responsibility, but there are everyday ARRL appointments that come from the section manager that are available to just about any ham that wants to support ARRL. So I think that what I would tell people, having spent 10 years involved in the ARRL, is that it's not what you think it is. It's a lot more than you think it is and a lot less than you think it is. You think that it's some sort of commercial behemoth that's trying to dominate ham radio and make a lot of money. It's a lot less than that. And you underestimate the influence that ARRL has on the global stage, where ham radio policy is really fixed. People tend to think of the FCC as being the end-all and be-all of amateur radio rules and regulations, but the FCC really looks to the International Telecommunications Union for the regulatory structure that they have to implement. And the ARRL is very, very, very deeply involved in the ITU as the International Secretariat of the IARU, which is the association or union of all of the amateur radio organizations worldwide, ARRL just being one of them. France has its own, England has RSGB, and so forth. All of these organizations come together under the IARU, and ARRL is really the glue that holds the IARU together. So ARRL is just involved in so much and has been responsible for so many wonderful things that have occurred in our hobby. I can't even imagine what ham radio would look like if ARRL didn't exist.
Well, just so that the listeners know, this wasn't a criticism of the ARRL at all. I have been a member of the ARRL since I was first licensed, except for perhaps the gap when I was raising a family. I am still an ARRL member. I pay more to get my QST magazine delivered in Israel, but I belong to the ARRL even as a person living outside of the United States, because exactly what you're saying is that I don't think that there is a better organization for the support and safety of amateur radio than ARRL. So that's my editorial opinion in terms of spectrum defense is my number one issue, and I think there's nobody that does it better than the ARRL.
ARRL does so much that hams aren't really that conscious of. And a lot of hams judge it by QST or, some tiny niche thing that only represents a small fraction of what ARRL is really involved in. So it's a wonderful organization with an incredibly rich history. We should be very proud of.
There's nobody getting rich over there.
Absolutely not.
From what I understand. The question I have, Walt, is that, so you didn't just become the director. Did you work your way up through the Rocky Mountain organization to become the director?
I did. I started out as the Contest Advisory Committee chairman. So we haven't talked about this, but I got involved in contesting in 1976 when the bicentennial contest started. There was a one-off competition called the Bicentennial Contest. We got a special call sign. I was AB0IRJ we could use for 1 year, and so it was a lot of fun. And I got in that contest. I really enjoyed it, so I decided I'm going to be a contester, and eventually I became chairman of the Contest Advisory Committee. And so that was my first introduction to the ARRL. And then I was invited by the director to run for vice director when there was an opening under him for vice director. I ran and was elected vice director, and that introduced me to Newington. I started going to Newington twice a year for a few years, and then eventually became director. And then I ran a number of committees. I was the chair of the Industry Advisory Council, which was really exciting because I got to interact with all of the major manufacturers in the ham radio world. And, of course, being from the consumer electronics field, that was a natural for me, and I really enjoyed it. I remember meeting people like Martin Jew and having dinner with them, and of MFJ. I really like Martin. He's a great guy. And lots of other people, Dick Airhorn and so forth, of ETO Alpha. So that was great. When I became director, they decided with my business background that they weren't going to let me be in DX, which I wanted to be, or contest, which I wanted to be. You're going to be in the administration and finance committee. So I became chairman of the A&F committee, which I really resented because I wanted to go to Newington to have fun and sort of have an extension of my fun ham time. But it ended up that was the place that I could do my best work for the ham radio community and for the ARL. So I accepted that role and tried to do my best.
Now, you were on the board of the ARRL Foundation. Are you still on the board?
I'm not, but I was on the board of the ARL.
As a commercial for the ARRL. And again, I'm a big supporter. What is the ARRL Foundation for people that may not know what it is?
The primary purpose of the ARL Foundation is to promote ham radio in youth. And the principal way that it does that is by offering scholarships to young hams to help them go to college. So it's just a wonderful it's a wonderful charity function, really, and it's a tradition that the ARL has had for many, many years. It's a wonderful tradition. So the foundation gives out a large number of scholarships of varying sizes every year. And if you watch QST closely, you'll see an annual announcement with the pictures of the young hams that are getting support to go to college.
And some old hams, I noticed. In this last group of pictures, there are some older people. Looks like they're transitioning in their lives to a new career, and so they're going back to college. And I saw that there were some scholarships for some older people as well. So I think that's always a good thing. If people get more education and someone can help them, I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let me ask you a question then. What are we doing right in terms of attracting younger people into ham radio? And maybe what could we do better in order to get more of them? I'm trying to put a positive spin on this question.
Well, I have my opinions, but I'm certainly not an expert on this. I feel that ham radio, there's a lot of magic in ham radio. And I think people today take magic for granted. We live in a magical world. We really do. We live in a magical world, surrounded by magic every day. When I was growing up, ham radio was the most magical thing that I've ever seen. I'm not sure that people growing up today would if they're exposed to ham radio, would say it's the most magical thing in their lives or that they've ever seen. But I still think it is. I certainly think it is. I think that the ability to bounce radio waves off the ionosphere is an incredibly exciting thing to do. I think that we as hams need to be more welcoming of young people. Like I said earlier, we don't have a watering hole for people that are learning where they can make mistakes. I see older hams assuming that people should know more than they really should know or could know when they first get into the hobby, and that creates the expectation that you've got to do it perfectly, which I think is a mistake. I think that ham radio ought to be a place where you can make a mess. Let's face it, the FCC set aside these slots of spectrum, and they expect us to make a mess in there. And we should be making more messes than we make. We certainly should be more accepting of people who make messes than we are, especially if they're young. So I think that this problem of youth in ham radio is something of our own making. I would note that in Europe that it's really not that way. I was talking with Dave Sumner, a friend of mine, K1ZZ, earlier recently, and he was telling me that the center of the youth movement in ham radio is not in the United States. It's in Europe, and so we can learn a lot from Europe. Croatia has a wonderful youth.
Did he say why?
I'm not sure we know why.
Oh, really?
I don't know.
My listeners have probably heard me over the last few weeks say this, so I told you earlier, I'm a Radio Merit Badge counselor for an American-style Boy Scout troop that we've started here in Israel. And the first troop happens to be in Efrat, where I live, and we've got 60 boys that are becoming Boy Scouts following the manual in Israel. For me, it's very exciting because I thought the scouting program in America was amazing. I had to go pitch my Radio Merit Badge to the group of kids, and I took the little Morserino with me, and I took my UHF handy-talkie to talk to the repeater that I could see out the window, and I had somebody there to answer, because on a lot of repeaters you can go, hello, anybody there, and there's nobody there, so I made sure that there was somebody there. And you know what was interesting to me is that the kids didn't understand or didn't realize that their cell phones and their Wi-Fi is radio. There was this light that went on. They loved the Morse code with the Morserino. They all wanted to play with that. But this idea that, is Wi-Fi radio? And I said, yes, we use radio all the time. My wireless earbuds, that's radio. And it's kind of like you can kindle the magic if all of a sudden you say, hey, no, the stuff that we're using all day long now is radio. We're using radio now more than we've ever used radio. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that perhaps the greatest invention ever in the history of mankind is the discovery of electromagnetic waves. So I completely agree with you. I think that we're not very good marketers. I just don't think we're not, I've become a marketer in my life, and the HS4A campaign is a marketing campaign, right? To change people's attitudes. And so I don't think that hams have ever been very serious about marketing. And there are a lot of incredibly exciting aspects to ham radio. And we touch on them when we talk to people about our hobby, but we're not very good at selling these ideas to other people, particularly young people.
Is it still magic to you?
Absolutely. I am sitting here literally looking at my SDR screen that's right in front of my face while I'm talking to you. I have to admit, I've glanced up at it a few times, and I can see literally 200 signals on the waterfall on 10 meters right now. The 10-meter contest is going on, and it is 10 meters is open, and it is incredibly exciting to see 10 meters come alive like this. Absolutely amazing.
I have a 7300, so I have a little screen over here on my left that I leave on 20 meters all day long, 20 meter CW. So I'm watching who's there, and I'm like, don't these people have a job? Don't these people work? It's so amazing to actually, with the waterfall display, to see the activity in the band. Even if I'm supposed to be working, I can enjoy the electromagnetic spectrum, at least in 20 meters. You have a blog, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes page. But I was caught by the latest article that you have in there. It's the personal recollections of Marconi. I'm not trying to pronounce his first name, but the first name is in there. And it's written as a first-hand account of growing up with Marconi. Are you headed towards writing fiction? And what was the inspiration for that piece?
The inspiration of the piece was from a woman that I know who's a real author. Her name is Patricia Fitch, and she contacted me because she writes children's books for teenagers. And she wanted to have a character in her latest book. She's written a number of books. But she wanted to have a character in that book who was a ham, and she needed expert guidance on how to talk about what he did. And so I spent hours talking to her about what we do, and she called me frequently to ask questions. Would he do this? Would he do that? He was on a boat. How would he communicate to shore? And would it be possible for him to talk to this person or that person? It's a mystery novel. And after talking to her about it, I thought, I'm really interested in Marconi. I'm going to write something. I'm going to write a piece of fiction about Marconi. Now, I love to write, but my articles typically are academic-style articles. I recently wrote an article about the economic sanctions in Ukraine, right? So pretty far away from nonfiction. But I love writing. So that's why I wrote that. And I love Marconi. Marconi's story is really amazing. So I encourage everybody to read this story that I wrote if they can find it.
There'll be a link in the show notes page for sure.
His story is amazing. And you know what? We may not realize this, people my age, my generation, but Marconi was a marketing genius, and Marconi marketed ham radio, or radio in general, to my parents. So I believe that the reason that my parents bought me my first receiver and then subsequently bought me a Swan 350 when I was in high school was because they knew the story of Marconi, even though I didn't. And Marconi, his greatest accomplishment occurred when he was 16, 17 years old.
Kind of like Art Collins.
So here's this teenage kid, right, who ends up becoming a bigger personality in the world than Steve Jobs was. I mean, people don't know how big Marconi was. He was huge. He even got a Nobel Prize, and he never even graduated from college. So the world just fell at his feet, and he got started doing his experiments. I call his experiments the distance game in my article that I wrote about him. The distance game. So he started playing the distance game, DX in other words, when he was a teenager, and proving first that you could go a few hundred yards, and then a few miles, and then a few tens of miles, and then a few hundreds of miles, and eventually spanning the Atlantic Ocean.
And he was doing that with Spark, right, at the time?
He was, yes.
Pretty broadband transmissions.
Definitely. But that's I'm a lover of DX. I love DX. DX has taught me so much about the world. It has gotten me into countries I never would have visited before, and certainly has enabled me to whet my appetite for pileups. So I'm a big promoter and fan of DX.
When you said earlier that you like to operate contests, do you like all kinds of contests like sweepstakes? And do you operate SO2R or something like very high speed and to get lots of contacts over the contest weekend?
I started out with sweepstakes. You can compete pretty well with sweepstakes here in Colorado. And then I graduated into CQ Worldwide, ARLDX, and competed very aggressively in those contests. But I quickly learned that from here in Colorado, right smack in the middle of the U.S., it's hard to win from Colorado. It's virtually impossible to win DX contests from Colorado. So I began to look. My eyes began wandering. First I went to the Bahamas in 1981 and entered my first contest, the CQ Worldwide and the ARL 160 contest from the Bahamas, and I really thought that was a lot of fun. Went over there with my family, and we had a great time. And then somebody mentioned Belize to me, and so in 1980, I think I went to the Bahamas in 79, 1980 and 81, I went to Belize and sort of learned the lay of the land there, and I decided I wanted to win the ARL DX contest CW, and so I went there a few times to practice and figure out how I might win, and then I went in 1983 and did win. And then I've continued to go back to Belize. I'm not as I'm not trying to win so much anymore. I just love being DX in a contest, in a DX contest. And so I've been going to Belize ever since.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. If you were going to advise a ham any ham, how to be successful in ham radio. Do you have some simple advice? This isn't the last question that I normally ask. It seems to me that hams that accomplish a lot, and you kind of brought this up with Belize, that you actually made a point of going for 2 years beforehand to kind of get the lay of the land, to understand what the obstacles are, where the goalposts are, in order to be able to go the third year and win. Do you create some kind of plan for success in ham radio, or do you set aside time on your calendar for ham radio? You're obviously a very busy guy. Do you have an answer, perhaps, that you could give to lead to ham radio success?
I think the most important thing is to turn on the radio every day, and even if you just listen and look at the bands, and the real key is to make regular contacts, and that's really been the key to my enjoyment of ham radio is just being active. My ham shack is on the first floor of my house. It's not in the basement of my house. It's in my office, or next to my office. It's accessible to me. My wife has an office, a desk in here too. So when I'm on the air or messing around with ham radio, I'm not away from my family. So I've woven it into my life in a sort of seamless way where it's not something separate from who I am and what I do. It's really an integral part of who I am and what I do.
It's my understanding that your family has also joined you in the hobby?
Well, they certainly support me. My wife is K0ZV, and she got her extra at a time when you had to pass Morse code test to get it. And so she's, I think, pretty serious and it really appreciates ham radio. She doesn't get on the air like I do, but she's very supportive of it. And when we go to Belize, I get her on the air, and she had a 200 hour on sideband one time in the ARDX phone contest. So I think she's a pretty good operator.
And you have children that are also ham radio operators?
Yeah, my son is a ham. He's not active, but he is a ham, and went to lots of swap meets with me and has done a lot of field days with me. And I also got my father into ham radio. When after he retired, he went and got his license, and we had a schedule every Saturday for an hour and a half. And my wife joked that he talked more freely on the air via ham radio to us than he did over the phone. He never wanted to talk over the phone, but when he got on the air, he was chatty. He's a silent key now, but he was very supportive of me. And as I was coming up as a kid, as I mentioned earlier, he was with IBM, had a technical sales job with IBM, and certainly saw that ham radio might have a positive influence in my life. And so he jumped into it himself.
It's my understanding that you're also working the Teeners, which are the over 11,000 feet in Colorado, as a SOTA operator. Is that right?
SOTA's been a lot of fun for me. I get the same kind of thrill out of it as I get setting up for field day. I've always enjoyed field day. I enjoy DXpeditions. H1A was really a lot of fun for me, and then I went to Christmas Island T32 also, and Belize is fairly common Caribbean country, but those were more exotic. And I like packaging up things, putting stations together, then getting into the field and actually deploying them and working people. It's a lot of fun.
What is the SOTA station? What are you taking with you into the field now?
Well, I've got a number of things. I think the most amazing thing is this Mountain Topper MTR3, which is about the size of a wallet. It runs 5 watts. It's CW only. In-fed half-wave antennas are kind of a hobby of mine, building them, building the traps, building the transformers. Just all of the little bits and pieces that go into making a great SOTA station are just a lot of fun. From the batteries to the key, having a small little pedal that you can actually use and sound good with in the field, having it be as light as possible. Here in Colorado, we got big mountains out here, very, very big mountains. And so the whole concept of weight and becomes much more a factor out here than it does at lower elevations, where you've got more oxygen and perhaps less elevation gain to accomplish your point total. You got to work really hard out here to get points, so those challenges make the SOTA operators out here very, very, very excellent operators, and also very accomplished at deploying stations. The weather changes so fast out here that I've been in blizzards where I had to deploy in a blizzard, make my 4 contacts, which is the minimum to get points from the summit, and get down off the mountain. And it's not a trivial matter. It's a real challenge, and there's a great deal of satisfaction that goes along with that. Plus, just being fit, being a ham operator. Sometimes we have this reputation of being couch potatoes, sitting in our chair in front of a radio and never moving. But out here in Colorado, the SOTA operators are very, very athletic, fit people. So it's just good for you. It's healthy.
What was your most challenging activation as a SOTA operator in Colorado?
Well, winter activations in blizzards are, when you get up, snowshoe. I snowshoed up one of them. It was almost 13,000 feet mountain, and snowshoed up, and it was a sunny day, and I got up to the top, and the wind was blowing like 60, 70 miles an hour. And even though it wasn't snowing, it was a blizzard conditions because the wind was blowing the snow around it. That was one of the most challenging. But any 14,000 foot mountain is a challenge for me, just to get up to the...
Well, it would be for most people. If they're flatlanders, then 14,000 feet, they'd be gasping for air.
Yeah, and so that's 3,000 feet of elevation gain, and that's a day. It takes you a day to get up there and get down, pretty much. And those are really challenging, but also very, very exciting. But I like bushwhacking. I like doing 13,000 foot mountains where there are no trails, and I'm hiking through the woods using Gaia GPS to point my way to the summit. So the idea of what I really like, Eric, is being out there by myself with my Gaia and route finding my way through dense forests to a treed summit, or maybe to a bald summit through trees and down timber and that kind of thing, and finally getting up there, having a view, sitting down, being on the air for an hour. To me, that's heaven. That's heaven, to be out in the wilderness like that, and then get on the air and maybe work some DX. I mean, I've worked New Zealand and Europe and Japan from the top of these summits with 5-watt radios, my KX3 or my MTR, and it's exciting, very, very exciting. And it's not unusual to work 60 people, 50 or 60 people either. There are a lot of great chasers out.
Do you carry any other safety equipment with you?
I do.
For backup?
Yeah, I carry a personal locator beacon, PLB it's called, and I've got something on my blog about that. It's a 4.5 ounce thing that I carry in my backpack, and that I can deploy if I get injured. And I'm in. It's amazing. APRS has incredible coverage in Colorado, but you got to be in the clear for it. If you're in a gully or a ravine or something, it's more difficult. So the PLB, I've never used the PLB, but I do take it. And I take plenty of water. I take extra clothes. I've got a whole list on my blog of the 10 essentials that you need to take if you're going to do SOTA in Colorado. I take all those things. I take it very seriously. It's dangerous on a certain level, at a certain level.
Well, when you think about it also, even if you needed help up there, it would take a while for that help to get to you. At that elevation, it's not like a helicopter is going to come in and take you off the summit.
Yeah, one of my ham buddies is in search and rescue up in Buena Vista, where I spend a lot of time, and he's always telling me stories about how long it took to get to somebody, and they had to stay overnight with them, and then they had to bring in a helicopter, and yeah, it can get pretty pretty dicey.
Did you want to talk a little bit about January, February of 1993, where you actually went to Howland Island? You alluded to it just earlier, AH-1A, where you actually created a documentary of that activation of Howland Island. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Every DXer's dream is eventually to be on the other side of a really rare country. I think that for most of us, it's just a fantasy. But I was invited to join that team, and there were 3 of us from Denver that were a part of that 10-person team, which was an international team. And there was so many firsts in my life that came out of that experience. It was really amazing. It was the first time I'd ever been to sea. We chartered an 80-foot schooner called the Machias. We sailed out of Hawaii. It was a 1-month commitment, so it took us almost a week at sea to get to Howland Island. Howland Island is a U.S. possession, but it's governed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's a wildlife preserve. So it's very difficult to get landing permission there. There are no inhabitants. There's no infrastructure.
It looks like an aircraft carrier, actually.
There aren't even any trees there. There aren't even trees. There are no trees. It's famous because that's where Amelia Earhart was headed when she was lost. There was actually an airfield there that the Navy had built in the wake of World War II or around that period in time. And so they did. It does look like an aircraft carrier. The island, it's desolate. It is a desert island. So many challenges there. And we had 2 doctors with us, and we needed them. There were a lot of injuries, a lot of near misses where people got injured, they could have died, got dragged over coral and swept out to sea, that kind of thing. It was a real adventure. It definitely was an adventure, and I think that you got to build yourself up to something like that. You got to be able to handle a pileup at any rate. You can't be intimidated by the biggest possible pileup that you can imagine, and you've got to be fit, and you've got to have hopefully some other skills that are useful to the team. But wow, what an experience. Really amazing.
You actually created a documentary on this project. It's called the AH-1 Saga Pacific Expedition to Howland and Baker Island. I'll put that up. When I watched it, what was interesting to me was it appeared to me that the way that you guys got off the island was everybody was holding on to this raft or this inflatable boat. You were kind of waiting until the wave went down.
Right.
Were you guys all in the water going back to the schooner in order to get off the island?
Yes. Howland is surrounded by a reef, and so it's impossible to bring a boat up to the island. So you had to go out into the ocean a distance, and then they would send Zodiacs out, which are the rubber inflatables, and then we would jump in those. And you didn't want to be flipped. And we were stranded on that island for a week. We had expected to leave on a certain date. We were stranded there for a week because we couldn't get off, because the surf came in and it was so large. It was so these waves were so tremendous that they would swamp and flip the Zodiacs, and so we had to stay there. Well, all kinds of things happened to the boat. It lost power, and it had to go out to sea to keep from being coming up on the reef and being permanently damaged. And so there are all kinds of adventures that occurred to get us off that island. And we ran out of water. I've never been without water in my entire life. I tell you, if you really want to feel uncomfortable, the most uncomfortable I think I've ever been in my entire life is being without water for a day and a half or something like that. You really have to have water, especially when you're on a desert island. So it was a real adventure, definitely.
I had one other question about that, and that is that in the documentary there were some fish and wildlife government people there.
Yeah, scientists.
Now, were they also on the island?
Yes, they were with us. They were part of our team.
Oh, they were part of the team, so they didn't have their own separate place.
No, they were part of the team. They came with us. That was part of our deal with Fish and Wildlife. Was we would take. They don't get to go very often. It's very expensive to get there, and they don't have the budget to go very often. So that's part of the deal. Is that when a ham team goes, they take a couple of scientists there. The scientists do a lot of things. They measure the bird population. They do a survey of the ecosystem of the island. So they were busy while we were operating.
What excites you most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Wow, what excites me most? Well, you can tell I'm pretty excited all the time. So I don't know. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think SOTA is super exciting, and I really enjoy it. It's just a good fit for Colorado and for what I'm interested in doing. But I don't know. I'm a member of FOC, of the CW Club. I really enjoy that. A member of CW Ops. I think that I'm excited about the fact that people want to learn CW on their own without it being a licensing requirement. They get into the game and they maybe do FD8 and some other things, and then they see CW might be interesting and they're moving in that direction. I'm just excited by the technology as well. I think that we have incredible technology today. I think the amplifiers, when I go to Belize now, I take a 1,000-watt amplifier, Eric, and this amplifier weighs, and I'm not kidding, it's the 12-pound amplifier. It's made by Juma. It uses LD Moss, and it is a marvel of technology. So I'm taking a KX3 and this JUMA amplifier and running 1,000 watts with an end-fed half-wave antenna, and it all fits into one carry-on that I can lift and put in an overhead bin.
But Walt, don't you think it's amazing that somebody, Elecraft in this case, can make a radio, an exciter that you can carry in the palm of your hand that is so clean that you can actually drive a 1,000-watt amplifier with it?
Well, I've owned a K3 and a KX3, and I got to tell you that the KX3 rivals the K3. And, so how did they do that? It really is a lot more than I expected it to be when I got it.
You always think that maybe this is from the old school, and that is that a small radio wouldn't have the filtering and wouldn't have all of the other things that it should have in order to drive an amplifier. So I think that's kind of amazing as well.
Yeah, it's clean, and it drives the amplifier. I love LD Moss because you can put out 1,000 watts with 3 watts input. So that's a marvel to me as well, having been used to needing 50 watts or sometimes 100 watts to get 1,500 watts out of a tube amp back in the day. So to have 3 watts and get a kilowatt out, that's pretty amazing to me. I love it.
Do you carry the spectral display that goes with the KX3?
I don't. No, I'm going lightweight.
Lightweight? You're going to earn this one. You won't have the spectrum display to lean on to see where everything is.
And I got to tell you, I love the spectrum display. I'm sitting right talking to you. I've got 3 monitors in front of me, 3 about 30-inch monitors, 2 up top next to one another and 1 down low. And I just, that excites me a lot to have all that information, that data, be able to look at the spectrum. And the call signs are popping up on the spectrum display and on top of the signals. And so that's exciting. I mean, the ham radio is progressing technologically. It's not standing still. We have some great tools, exciting tools.
And what's the current rig? What are you using right now?
I have a number of rigs. My rig of choice at the moment is a Sun SDR. It's a really interesting radio. And I've got a KPA 1500 amplifier in the shack by Elecraft. The Sun SDR is made by Expert Electronics, and they are a really interesting company. They are in Russia. Russia is making some interesting products. They make They make a TX500, a little competitor to the KX3, which is very high-tech product. That comes out of Russia, and so does the Sun.
That's the one that's in the milled aluminum case, right?
That's right.
They've hollowed out a block of aluminum and they put the radio in it?
Yeah. So I've got one of those, and the amplifier that comes out of Germany that matches up with it. It's just exciting tech, and I'm a tech geek. I'm a hardware guy. I love really well-executed hardware. We really are kind of in a heyday right now, especially when you look at compact rigs like the KX3, KX2, the MTR, this 599 TX500 milled aluminum thing is amazing. Unfortunately, they're in Russia, and so I'm sure they're being affected by the Ukraine war. Certainly not as much as the Ukrainians are being affected, but Sun SDR is very close to Ukraine. They're only 100 miles away. So,
well, Rig Expert is in Ukraine, although I've heard that they've moved their operation out of the Ukraine proper, at least at this point, in order to continue to manufacture.
So with this Human Security for All, I've been traveling a lot to the Eastern Europe. I was in Baku, Azerbaijan in June, and then I was in Bucharest in October, right on the border with Ukraine. I spent half a day one-on-one with the former First Lady of Ukraine. So I'm praying. I have a real personal investment in the situation over there, and really am praying for a diplomatic solution quickly to that problem. It's very unfortunate, and it really needs to be resolved.
Well, for those of us that live outside of the United States, we always pray for a diplomatic resolution to problems.
Absolutely, we do.
Because the world is a dangerous place otherwise.
That's right. What
advice would you give to new or returning hams?
I would say find an Elmer. Go to clubs, find an Elmer. I am an Elmer. I really enjoy it, and I've seen how much it's been beneficial to the people that I've Elmered, and how appreciative they are of it, and how much more quickly they can advance. I just think the way I did it as a teenager when I didn't have an Elmer was there's so many stupid things that I did, like spreading rock salt in my yard to make my radials work better, and killing my grass, much to the chagrin of my mom, almost electrocuting myself a couple of times. Those were all avoidable problems if I had an Elmer. So, I think having an Elmer is really good. And now with YouTube and all that, you can immerse yourself in all these wonderful YouTube channels, and they're very, very, very educational and helpful. So just take advantage of the great tools we have out there and get on the air. Do not fear. Put fear aside and get on the air.
We've gone way over what I normally do, but you know what? I've kind of decided in my life that when I'm talking to someone very interesting that I don't have to impose, it's a podcast after all, I don't have to impose a artificial stop point unless the guest decides he wants to bail out. So I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I've really have come away with some new appreciations thanks to you, and I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much.
You're welcome, Eric. It's been a pleasure talking to you. 73 from Denver.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Walt. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W0CP in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.